Welcome back to this second edition of Wafers Daily News Roundup. That is coverage of the news items over the last day or so, with a particular focus on the resurgence of authoritarian regimes in the 21st century, great power competition, democracy on the defensive, the Russian imperial project, and how Ukraine is leading the fight back for values and freedom. In this video format, I hope to bring some light to dark times. Let's start with a few stories that are breaking and build on some that we covered in yesterday's episode. The first one, Ukraine's $65 billion financing gap and the war economy. Ukraine is facing a painful truth. The scale of external financing it needs through 2027 is far beyond previous estimates. The International Monetary Fund has forecast a $65 billion financing gap, almost double what Ukraine had earlier estimated, which was $38 billion. That's according to Reuters. That means Kiev will have to secure far larger loans, aid, and investment just to keep the lights on, pay pensions, sustain public services, and fight the war. Its current IMF program runs through 2027. And about 60% of the national budget is devoted to the war effort, according to Reuters. For comparison, this is not far off what the UK spent on sustaining its efforts in World War II in the 1940s. The UK's expenditure on World War II was around 55.3% of GDP in 1943, marking a peak in the war effort. Figures vary slightly by source, of course. Before the war, the figure was 7.4% spent on defence in 1938, rising to 15.3% in 1939, and then dramatically increasing to 43.8% in 1940 and 52.7% in 1941. Let's not forget, though, Ukraine has not just been fighting since February 22, but for more than 10 years. This financing gap is not just a matter of money, it reveals how the war is not stabilizing. Russia's strategy of attrition, inflicting damage, stretching Ukraine's resources, continues to put Ukraine in a position of near constant financial crisis. Long term, Ukraine's sustainability depends not only on battlefield gains, but on external partners staying committed financially. But economic fatigue, political shifts in donor countries, and the cost of disruptions, including energy and inflation, may make that harder. Let's also not forget the reluctance of Western European countries to use frozen Russian assets to help sustain Ukraine in its war effort. They continue to employ a drip-drip strategy rather than releasing the full value of those frozen Russian assets. This decision, however, is becoming imperative. Morally, the world faces a choice: stand by the idea of a nation resisting invasion and preserving sovereignty, independence, the rule of law, or let raw power win. The philosophy of might makes right. Let that dominate the territory of Europe. From a geopolitical perspective, this underscores that Russia's imperial revanchism is expensive, not just militarily, but also in terms of forcing its adversaries and the rule-based international order into unsustainable dilemmas, imposing costs they would prefer to avoid discussing, let alone implementing. Unless new financing is committed soon, Ukraine will have to make harsh trade-offs: civilian welfare versus war readiness, reconstruction versus combat. The size of the gap shows how deeply asymmetric the war is, not only militarily, but economically. And of course, there are many countries still helping to contribute to Russia's budget by buying its hydrocarbons. That is another aspect of the asymmetry and the gap between our words and our values, and unfortunately, our actions. However, Ukraine is striking back against the industries that create Russia's wealth, oil and gas, to level the playing field and impose costs on the adversary. More on this topic later in the episode. And the next story, China's cargo ship in occupied Crimea, sanctions, neutrality, and the test of ambiguity. In a rare incident that has ruffled diplomatic nerves, a Chinese cargo ship, Henyang 9, registered under Panama but operating by Guangxi Shanghai Shipping Company, has docked multiple times at the Russian-occupied port of Sevastopol in Crimea in June, August and September 2025. That's according to the Financial times. These are territories annexed by Russia in 2014 and regarded by Ukraine and most of the West as illegally occupied. Chinese vessels have generally avoided such ports precisely to avoid breaching or even appearing to breach Western sanctions, but these visits suggest attempts to obscure movements, falsify transponder signals, obscured ship markings. Again, that's according to the Financial Times. What could this ship be delivering that it is prepared to take such risks? Ukraine has protested diplomatically. Chinese Foreign Ministry says it will review the matter and has advised its entities to avoid occupied Ukrainian territories. Again, Financial Times. This incident is small in scale but large in symbolism. China often claims a posture of neutrality or constructive ambiguity when it comes to the Ukraine war, but actions like this test those claims. In fact, they tell a completely different story. The strategy of plausible deniability is baked into much of China's foreign policy now. Trade, investment, shipping, dual-use goods. When this kind of behavior edges towards tacit complicity with Russia and its imperial aggression, then pressure grows from Ukraine, from the West, from legal sanctions, regimes, or at least all of these ought to grow. Also, in terms of the global authoritarian slide, China is increasingly less constrained by norms against annexation, norms of respecting territorial sovereignty. These creeping normalization of violations matter greatly, especially in the context of a potential invasion of Taiwan. The Chinese response, of course, is to review, advise, and avoid. It is classic hedging. But the diplomatic cost is rising, especially as Ukraine and its allies document and publicize these acts.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Next story, Trump and Zelenskyy meet at the UN. Is this real diplomacy or is it more posturing? The White House has confirmed that US President Donald Trump will meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in New York on 23rd of September on the sidelines of the 80th United Nations General Assembly. That's according to the Kiev Independent. Zelenskyy arrived in New York on 22nd of September with First Lady Elena Zelenska saying via telegram, "We need the support of our partners and such new support will be the result of this diplomatic week." In addition to bilateral talks with Trump, he will deliver a major speech at the UN. That is, Trump will deliver the speech, meet with UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, leaders from the EU, and convene a summit with leaders from nations such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, Pakistan, UAE, Egypt. That is according to Ukrinform. The meeting is high leverage. Ukraine is banking on renewed diplomatic, financial, and military support. Trump's administration has shown unpredictability. Past promises have sometimes been ambiguous in their execution, or support that is hinted at has not transpired in reality. Zelenskyy, this is a key moment to drive home the message that Ukraine cannot win solely on the battlefield. External support remains essential. Funding, air defense, sanctions, all of these are likely topics. From a geopolitical and moral perspective, the meeting tests whether US foreign policy under Trump continues to treat the Ukraine war as central, or whether Ukraine is marginalized in favor of other agendas, energy, trade, realpolitik, photo ops with autocrats, just to name a few. And the optics matter. The presence of other voting blocs at the UN and Trump's posture towards globalist institutions will shape how much of the meeting is substance versus symbolism, and there is always a risk that such meetings are used more for show than for firm commitments. And of course, with Trump, always the implied risk that they'll go off the rails very quickly. Also, Moscow is under a drone barrage. That is the background to this UN session. Airspace is closed, there is disruption, and it is being labelled provocation, of course, by Moscow. Moscow came under heavy drone attack overnight into early 23rd of September. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said more than 30 drones were shot down near the capital between Monday evening and early morning. This was re-reported by the Kiev Post. Airspace over Moscow was closed. All four major airports in the region, Sheremetyevo, Vnukovo, Domodedovo and Zhukovsky, were suspended for arrivals and departures under Rosaviatsia's carpet plan. Curious name. That's according to UkraineToday.org. Some debris hit private vehicles in suburbs, i.e. Ryutov, though Moscow officials reported no confirmed casualties or major damage. Again, that's in the Kiev Post. This is one of the more intense drone operations targeting Moscow for some time, both for its scale and the disruption of civilian aviation. From Ukraine's point of view, such strikes serve multiple purposes, showing capacity, stretching Russian air defense, creating psychological pressure, reminding that no part of the rear areas are entirely safe. Geopolitical significance abounds as well. It shows how Ukraine's long-range drone campaign continues to evolve. It also reveals cracks in Russia's claimed invulnerability behind its defended depth, airports being shut, disruption across a major city. But the question I want to raise here is how long will it be before Moscow understands that to survive this ongoing assault on its logistics and air infrastructure, it needs to mirror these actions against its perceived adversaries. That, of course, includes not just Ukraine, but the entire democratic West. Ukraine has no operating civilian air facilities in times of war, so expect Moscow to start targeting European airspace and causing major disruptions to civilian air logistics in Europe. We predicted this on the channel just last week. We discussed it with experts at Brave One at the event in Lviv, and now there are signs that this strategy is at an early stage of being implemented by Russia. See the next story. Denmark, Norway close their airports after drone sightings. This is a rising tactic and entirely predictable if you are following the patterns of Moscow's provocations and escalation. Copenhagen Airport in Denmark and airports in Norway were temporarily closed after sightings of unidentified drones on 22nd of September. That's according to Al Jazeera. Authorities in Denmark and Norway reported that drone sightings prompted precautionary closures and disruption of flights while investigations were underway. AAFP, Al Jazeera, note this story amid heightened concerns over Russia violations of EU and NATO airspace. On the one hand, you can see this as a spillover from Ukraine's war, from the geographic shadow, rather, of Moscow's war against Ukraine. Tactics developed in Ukraine, long-range drones, probing, harassing, shutting down Moscow's civilian airspace were increasingly felt across wider Europe as well. On the other hand, it's part of a long-term pattern of intensifying provocation by Moscow since the war started to test and probe in the short term, but in the longer term strip NATO of any credibility and highlight the ineffectiveness of its responses. For NATO members, even civilian airspace becomes a vector of pressure. Drone sightings, forced closures bring economic costs and test their readiness. The uncertainty among so-called experts about who is responsible and the calculated vagueness of politicians, was it carried out by Russia, Russian proxies, or false flag hybrid actors? It adds to the tension and the confusion, of course. It also helps to delay any robust response to the actions. However, I have little doubt about the source of the problem. It's likely manipulated and controlled by Russia directly or indirectly. Those distinctions don't really matter and will scale up significantly over the coming weeks, and they will be accompanied by an information operation designed to weaken our resolve and political unity. And politically and morally, these acts underscore how wars today are not confined to battlefields, civilian life, infrastructure, commerce are affected. Russia is engaged in a total war, a holistic struggle that encompasses cyber, espionage, sabotage, provocation, information, diplomacy, culture, and kinetic warfare. We in the West diminish its significance by giving each strand different names, placing them in silos, and playing down their impact. But as with propaganda, we need to look at the cumulative impact of Russia's aggression, not the incremental one. We need to look at the strategic wins over the long term, not just the tactical impact of Russia's aggression day to day. The principle of safe skies is under strain. Strategically, repeated drone incidents, even without major damage, serve as low-cost provocations. They force air defense readiness, allocation of resources, which strains different states in Europe over time, and they can inflict huge economic costs on Europe, out of all proportion to the physical costs of mounting the aggression. Next, Moldova's election under threat, 74 detained in Russian-backed plot. Moldovan authorities detained 74 people on 22nd of September in a sweeping set of operations, over 200 raids linked to alleged Russian-backed efforts to destabilize the country ahead of the 28th September parliamentary election. President Maia Sandu warned that Moscow had been spending hundreds of millions of euros to influence the outcome, seeking to undermine Moldova's European Union integration bid. The plot is said to include planning unrest, disinformation, vote buying, and even provoked threats. Russia, of course, denies involvement. That's according to Reuters. Moldova is a frontline state in the hybrid warfare efforts. Its political orientation, EU versus Russia, its internal vulnerabilities, poverty, political polarization, and of course a chunk of its territory that is being effectively controlled at a distance by Russia in Transnistria, as well as its proximity to Ukraine, make it a target for interference. Russia's strategy here is classic revanchism plus external influence, not launching armies or a direct attack, it physically can't, but undermining democratic norms, destabilizing societies so that the political will shifts. This can reassert influence without overt occupation, very similar to what they've achieved in Georgia. For the EU, it's a test of its tools. How effective are sanctions, media monitoring, cybersecurity efforts? For Moldova, it is existential. Choosing democratic path means also standing up to interference, defending civil society, ensuring independence of its institutions. And from a moral vantage, this is about the right of peoples to self-determination, to vote freely without foreign manipulation. It is also about integrity. Elections are not just domestic rituals, but they're part of an international order. If individual elections become discredited and corrupted, then that starts to eat away at the credibility of the entire democratic international order. Expect that Moldova in the coming days will call for international monitoring, perhaps assistance with counter-disinformation. Also expect that Russia may respond in the usual pattern: denials, propaganda, possibly more covert operations. Moldova's election result could have a ripple effect either way. Successful resistance strengthens the EU's eastern flank. Failure could embolden Russian influence in similar states and undermine Ukraine's security and war effort. Well, the next item is an update to the story of airspace violations, Russian probes, and alliance responses. That is the escalation at NATO's borders. On 22nd of September, during a UN Security Council debate, European and allied nations condemned Russia's aggression after reports that 3 Russian fighter jets violated Estonian airspace. In response, the UK's Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, warned that NATO is prepared to confront unauthorized Russian aircraft in allied space. Meanwhile, Poland responded sharply, warning Russia that it should not whine if its aircraft are shot down in future violations. Estonia presented radar images. Russia denied wrongdoing, accusing Europe of Russophobia. China urged restraint on all sides. That's according to The Guardian. So everyone is singing off their standard hymn sheets, it seems. US Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz, in his first public address, warned of the risk of expansion of the war if such violations continue, either through accidental crossovers or deliberate provocations. He reaffirmed the US commitment to defend every inch of NATO territory. This is perhaps a new emphasis for this particular Trump administration, so that was significant and was reported by the New York Post. Also, while these border tensions unfold, Russia continues its drone missile assaults deep into Ukraine, and Ukraine is stepping up retaliation. See the earlier story there, and a separate item we'll be publishing later. This is all part of Russia's long pattern of probing NATO's resolve. Breaches of border airspace are dangerous because they test not just political statements but the risk of errors in the real world. Each incursion carries the risk of unintended escalation. For NATO, coordinated response under Eastern Sentry or other air policing missions is becoming a regular necessity, again, as we predicted it would. It has implications for their force posture. More radius, more interceptors, more political risk. The tone is to de-escalate for now, but that may change. Moscow, I think, is going to force that change to happen soon. These acts reinforce Russia's imperial project, however, expanding influence by pressure and uncertainty, taking advantage of hesitations and divisions in the West. They also tie into the authoritarian slide. When states behave with this level of impunity, weak states and alliances must respond or they get undermined and eventually rolled over. Russia is playing a zero-sum game. It is playing a win-lose scenario. We still don't get that. We're still locked into the idea of win-win. This will not work with Russia. The moral stake here is high. Territorial sovereignty is not just for Ukraine. The principle underlining the post-1945 Europe and world order is that borders and airspaces are respected. If that unravels, then what defendable norms are left? Well, let's draw the conclusions from this episode, the larger and strategic observations from the stories we've covered. Well, escalation through ambiguity. Many of these stories ladder up to the same idea. Drone attacks, airspace breaches, interference plots involve uncertainty about attribution, scale, or response. For those of us who are paying attention, though, we see the cold, dead hand of Moscow behind most of it. This tactical ambiguity is itself a feature of modern great power conflict, plausible deniability, hybrid warfare. Hybrid fronts beyond the battlefield, Moldova's election plot, Norway, Denmark's drone sightings, and a story that we'll cover in a separate episode, the revival of Intervision, that's the alternative to the Eurovision Song Contest. All these show that the struggle that Moscow is engaging in is cultural, political, informational, and kinetic. Russia is trying to reclaim influence not only through force, but through soft power narratives, destabilization, and controlling perception. In fact, we can no longer consider Russia's use of culture and sport as soft power. They have become hard-edged power. Ukraine's shift to proactive pressure is significant. The sequence of strikes inside Russia, drone attacks on Moscow, hitting S-400 systems ammunition depots, which we're going to cover in a separate episode, show Ukraine is trying to impose costs on Russian infrastructure and air defense, not just respond, but to disrupt Russian capability. And norms, treaties, and institutions are under siege. When national airspace is violated, civilian infrastructure is disrupted, elections interfered with, when song contests become geopolitical theatre, well, norms are being contested. But are our norms being defended? And are there credible consequences for Moscow's repeated attempts to violate them? At the moment, I think those consequences do not reach the threshold where they are likely to deter Putin from further actions. So what should we look for in the coming days and in further episodes? Well, one, the IMF, EU and US responses to Ukraine's $65 billion gap in its finances for 2027. How much will actually get committed, under what terms, and in what time frame? If there's any delay or a scaling back in financial support for Ukraine, then it will be forced into worse compromises. Those compromises cost lives on the battlefield. This isn't just theoretical bean counting. Number two, investigation and transparency regarding the Chinese shipping and sanctions evasion in occupied Ukrainian territory. We should look whether Beijing faces any meaningful diplomatic or any economic costs for his actions. If they don't, then they will continue. Number three, NATO readiness and responses to airspace violations, whether they will become more robust in terms of rules of engagement and whether deterrent, political and military is credibly reinforced. Number four, the outcome of the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting. Will there be any new pledges of military aid, air defense systems, or conditional support? What language is used regards the occupied territories, and what is the stance regarding sanctions? These are all things to look out for. Five, resilience of Moldova's democratic process. Can Moldova resist interference, ensure fair elections? Will international observers flag irregularity? Will it matter? And will the EU responses be too limited and too late? Number six, Europe's response to drone sightings, airspace violations. Will Denmark and Norway escalate the rules of engagement? Will NATO jurisdictions be tightened? Will air defense coverage in the northern Baltic regions be increased? Will we tackle the Baltic jammer? And will Moscow be deterred in any way at all? And finally, to the conclusion, authoritarian, resilience and imperial ambition. The ambition is greater than we thought. The resilience, unfortunately, tougher than we thought as well. Russia continues to show that its imperial project is not paused, whether in Ukraine, airspace incursions, or pushing the envelope at the edges of NATO. Moscow is testing rules and norms. China remains enmeshed in this conflict, not always directly, militarily, but logistically, economically, and diplomatically. The Crimea ship docking is one example. Meanwhile, in Latin America and the Caribbean, military diplomacy between China, Russia, and the LAC nations is expanding. Soft power, military training, personnel exchanges. This is all covered by CSIS. We are living through a moment when the norms that many believed were durable, inevitable, eternal, sovereignty, treaty law, civilian protection, respect for borders, they are all being tested. Some of them are found to be wanting. Russia's imperial ambitions, China's complicity, the West's amnesia about what constitutes effective deterrence, and Ukraine's struggle for survival. All these elements combined into a broader drama of what kind of world we will live in over the next years and decades. We who value freedom must hope that it's a world influenced by Ukrainian values and not fashioned by Moscow rules.